Today, I'm beginning to read The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, authors of All the President's Men. We'll begin with the foreword, which is written by the authors in December 1975. This was published in 1976. Author's note, but before the foreword, says The Final Days is the work of four people: Scott Armstrong, a former Senate Watergate Committee investigator, and Al Kamen, a freelance writer and researcher, assisted us full-time in the reporting, research, and some of the writing. Their contributions were immeasurable. We are the beneficiaries of their intelligence, imagination, sense of organization, and diligence. We will never be able to thank them enough. Now the foreword. As reporters for the Washington Post, we began covering the Watergate story a few hours after 5 men were arrested at the Democratic National Headquarters on June 17, 1972. Our work for the Post on that story lasted more than 2 years, until Richard M. Nixon resigned the presidency on August 9, 1974. After the resignation, some of our most reliable sources said that the real story of those final days of the Nixon presidency had not been adequately told. To report that story and sort through the contradictions would require concentrated effort of perhaps a year or more. Our editors at the Post agreed. We took a leave of absence from the paper and set up an office on the 6th floor of the Post building. Scott Armstrong, a former Senate Watergate Committee investigator, and Al Kamen, a freelance writer-researcher, were hired to assist us. We divided the project into 22 areas of inquiry: President Nixon, the Nixon family, key White House aides, the White House lawyers, other senior members of the White House staff, the presidential speechwriting staff, the White House press office, former Nixon aides, the president's personal staff, the medical staff, the congressional liaison staff, the anti-impeachment lobby, the Office of Secretary of State Kissinger, the other cabinet members, the Office of Vice President Ford, the unofficial transition team, the House and Senate leadership, the House Judiciary Committee, the Office of the Watergate Special Prosecutor, the Senate Watergate Committee, others who visited or talked with the president. Finally, the public record: newspaper stories, books, public statements, testimony, and documents. From those areas of inquiry, we drew up a preliminary list of several hundred people to be interviewed. We spent 6 months at the task. The Final Days is based on interviews with 394 people. Some persons spent dozens of hours with us and volunteered information freely. One person was interviewed 17 times. Many supplied us with contemporaneous notes, memoranda, correspondence, logs, calendars, and diaries. Others granted interviews simply to give their version of events or to respond to information we had obtained elsewhere. A few, including President Nixon, declined to be interviewed. All interviews were conducted, quote, on background. That is, they were on the record. We could use the information, but only upon our assurance that the identity of the source would remain confidential. With this guarantee, those we talked to were willing to give us information we would never otherwise have been able to obtain. In general, we tried to interview the principals described in The Final Days only after extensive details had already been gathered from members of their staffs. We made clear to each person that we would attempt to check every detail. The notes from each interview were typed, and each significant detail was indexed under the appropriate area of inquiry. The subject areas were further divided chronologically into each of the final 100 days of the Nixon administration, the period we initially planned to describe in the narrative. In the course of interviewing, we realized that to explain the last 100 days, we would have to deal extensively with earlier periods, particularly the 6 months after April 30th, 1973, when President Nixon's chief aides resigned. We have attempted to check every detail in the course of reconstructing events. In reporting meetings, for example, we were able to, in almost all instances, to talk to one or more of the participants. If we obtained two versions, we resolved disagreements through re-interviewing. If this proved impossible, we left out any material we could not confirm. In a few instances, there were meetings between two participants where we were unable to obtain a direct account from either. In those cases, we interviewed people the participants talked to immediately afterward. Nothing in this book has been reconstructed without accounts from at least two people. We were fortunate. In those last days in the White House, the principals compared notes among themselves and with their assistants. We did not accord equal weight to all sources. In the course of over 3 years of reporting on the Nixon administration, we had learned to place extraordinary trust in the accuracy and candor of some sources. We had also talked regularly over the same period of time with a small number of people who consistently sought to give versions of events that were slanted, self-serving, or otherwise untrustworthy. We used information from them only when we were convinced by more reliable sources of its accuracy. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, December 1975. So let me read the cast of what they call the cast of characters. So these are the names that are going to be involved throughout the book. I know many of these because I was a Watergate buff and I read everything I could get my hand on back during it was happening. The backstory is that I was planning. I was a senior at OBU when the 1972 election rolled around. I was planning to vote for Nixon. I wasn't necessarily a Republican, but I was, I kind of, at that time, I still trusted authority, and, I watched Nixon's comments on when he would come on with a special announcement about Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, so forth, bombings and all that. I tended to trust him. He was the president. I hadn't yet learned there was what they call the credibility gap. And so September of 1972, beginning of my senior year at OBU, I was a resident assistant in Brotherhood Dorm. And one night, two or three of the other resident assistants kind of cornered me in the dorm office. And they said, "You need to start paying attention to what's going on with this Watergate thing." Now, understand, this is September 1972. The burglary just happened in June. So this was in the very early stages of the reporting on it. But Woodward and Bernstein were already reporting. It was, and Newsweek magazine was owned by the Washington Post, so much of their reporting got into Newsweek. Time magazine also had stories on Watergate. So they showed me. I didn't take any news magazines at that time. I didn't subscribe to any of them. They said, "You've got to start reading this stuff." So I did. I started subscribing to Time and Newsweek, reading them regularly. And in November of 1972, I cast my first presidential vote. I had turned 21 that year, the very year they gave 18-year-olds the vote. So anyway, this was my first vote, and it would have been my first presidential vote anyway. But anyway, I had turned 21 early that year. So I cast my first presidential vote for George McGovern. After reading all I had about Watergate, I decided Nixon couldn't be trusted, and I voted for McGovern. And that's one of the presidential votes of which I'm proudest to this day. George McGovern was a good man, would have made a fine president. Anyway, so those guys saved me from, and I've never voted for a Republican for president to this day. Anyway, I was a Watergate buff. In 1974, March of 1974, I started work at Southwestern Bell Telephone in Shawnee. I'd stayed in Shawnee because of Joanna. We were dating and she was still in school. So I'd stayed there after I'd graduated in 73. I got a job with Southwestern Bell Telephone as a telephone operator on the old cord board. And that day I met Bob Morris, who was also starting his first day as an employee. We trained together, went through 6 weeks of training together. We worked 1 to 10 shifts those first months. And so we started 1 in the afternoon, got off 10 at night. And after we got off, we quickly learned, soon after we met and started working together, we quickly learned that we had each voted for George McGovern in 1972. There weren't a lot of Oklahomans who could say that. So this bonded us. And we also found we were both Watergate buffs. Both read extensively on it and paid attention to it. And so we'd get off work at 10 o'clock at night, and we'd stand out in the parking lot for a couple of hours talking Watergate and Nixon. And we jokingly through the years we took credit for Nixon resigning only 4 months after, or 5 months after we met. March, I think I might have said March of 1974. Can you give me one of the others? One behind. Thank you. Thank you. So that bonded us for the rest of Bob's life, the rest of our friendship. We became best friends. Bob was my best man 2 years later. When Joanna and I got married, he and I remained best friends for all those years until he passed away in 2022. So for 48 years, we were best friends. Talked incessantly on the phone because we didn't live near each other after Joanna and I moved to Denver in 1977. But we remained close friends and talked on the phone for hours at a time. And a lot of politics, as well as other subjects, but it was a lot of politics we talked. But it all began with Watergate. It all began with Watergate and Richard Nixon, our friendship. So, as I said, I was a Watergate buff. I know most of these names, but I want to read them so we can get that on the record of who these people are that are going to be discussed in the final days by Woodward and Bernstein. So they give the names alphabetically. Robert Applenaup, friend of the president. Carl Albert, Speaker of the House. He was from Oklahoma, by the way. From, if I remember right, Bug Tussle, Oklahoma. Speaker of the House. Ollie Atkins, official White House photographer. Richard Ben Benisti, Assistant Watergate Special Prosecutor. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Brennan, military aide to the President. Patrick J. Buchanan, Assistant to the President, speechwriter. Philip Buchan, friend of the Vice President, coordinator of the transition team. Stephen Bull, personal aide to the President. Dean Birch, political counselor to the President. Warren Burger, Chief Justice of the United States. Arthur F. Burns, Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, former counselor to the President. George Bush, Chairman, Republican National Committee. M. Caldwell Butler, Congressman, Republican of Virginia, member of the House Judiciary Committee. Alexander P. Butterfield, former assistant to H.R. Haldeman. J. Fred Bazart, Special White House Counsel for Watergate, former counsel, Department of Defense. Joseph Califano, Washington attorney. Ken W. Clausen, Director of Communications, the White House. Charles W. Colson, former Special Counsel to the President. Barbara B. Conable, Congressman, Republican of New York, fourth-ranking member of the minority. Lieutenant Commander Andrew Combe, skipper of the presidential yacht Sequoia. Archibald Cox, Watergate Special Prosecutor. Edward Cox, son-in-law of the President. Tricia Nixon Cox, daughter of the President. John W. Dean III, former counsel to the President. Tom D. Care, press aide, the White House. John Doerr, counsel, House Judiciary Committee. James Doyle, press chief, Watergate Special Prosecution Force. Lawrence Eagleburger, assistant to Secretary of State Kissinger. John D. Ehrlichman, former assistant to the President for Domestic Affairs. David Eisenhower, son-in-law of the President. Julie Nixon Eisenhower, daughter of the President. Senator Sam Ervin, Chairman, Senate Watergate Committee. Margaret Foote, Secretary to Raymond K. Price, Jr. Gerald R. Ford, Vice President of the United States. Frank Gannon, Deputy to Ronald L. Ziegler, who was Nixon's press secretary. Leonard Garment, Counsel to the President. David Gergen, White House speechwriter. Gergen just passed away recently, I believe. Connie Gerard, Secretary, White House Press Office. Barry Goldwater, Senator, Republican of Arizona. L. Patrick Gray III, former Acting Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Ann Greer, Secretary, White House Press Office. Robert P. Griffin, Senator, Republican of Michigan, Minority Whip. General Alexander M. Haig, Jr., Chief of Staff, the White House. H.R. Bob Haldeman, former Chief of Staff, the White House. Bryce Harlow, Political Counselor to the President. Brooks Harrington, friend of David Eisenhower. Muriel Hartley, Secretary to General Alexander M. Haig, Jr. Robert Hartman, Chief of Staff, Office of the Vice President. William Henkel, Chief of White House Advance Team. Bruce Hershenson, Public Relations Aide, the White House. Lawrence Higbee, former Assistant to H.R. Haldeman, Aide in Office of Management and Budget. Leon Jaworski, Watergate Special Prosecutor. He followed Cox. Jerry Jones, Staff Secretary of the White House. Major George Jowin, Aide to General Alexander M. Haig, Jr. Richard Kaiser, Secret Service agent in charge of presidential detail. Kenneth Kachigian, aide to Patrick Buchanan. Henry A. Kissinger, Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, Secretary of State. Rabbi Baruch Korf, Chairman, Citizens Committee for Fairness to the Presidency. Tom Korologos, aide to William Timmons for Liaison to the Senate. Philip A. Lacavara, Counsel, Watergate Special Prosecution Force. Charles Lichtenstein, Assistant to Dean Birch. Rear Admiral William Lukash, Physician to the President. Lawrence Lynn, Member Transition Team, former aide to Henry A. Kissinger. Mike Mansfield, Senate Majority Leader. Jack McCahill, Deputy to James St. Clair. Father John McLaughlin, Public Relations Aide, the White House. John N. Mitchell, former Attorney General of the United States, manager of the 1972 Nixon re-election campaign. Pat Nixon, wife of the President. Richard M. Nixon, President of the United States. Sam Powers, Assistant Special Counsel to the President for Watergate. Raymond K. Price, Jr., Assistant to the President and speechwriter. Thomas F. Railsback, Congressman, Republican of Illinois, member, House Judiciary Committee. Charles G. Beebe Rebozo, friend of the President. John J. Rhodes, House Minority Leader. Elliot L. Richardson, Attorney General of the United States, former Secretary of Defense. Peter W. Rodino, Jr., Chairman, House Judiciary Committee, Congressman, Democrat of New Jersey. William P. Rogers, Secretary of State. That's Nixon's first term. Kissinger was named Secretary of State at the beginning of Nixon's second term. James D. St. Clair, Special Counsel to the President for Watergate. Manolo Sanchez, Valet to the President. Diane Sawyer, deputy to Ronald L. Ziegler. Yes, the same Diane Sawyer who went on to be a TV correspondent for ABC News. Hugh Scott, Senate Minority Leader. Lieutenant General Brent Scowcroft, Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, aide to Henry A. Kissinger. John J. Sirica, Judge, United States District Court for the District of Columbia. Helen Smith, Press Secretary to Mrs. Nixon. Larry Speakes, Press Secretary to James D. St. Clair. Speakes would later be Ronald Reagan's press secretary when Reagan was president. He was assistant press secretary. After Press Secretary James Brady was wounded and compromised, his hit in the head, and brain was compromised, so forth, paralyzed and all, in the assassination attempt on Reagan, then Speakes, for the rest of the Reagan administration, I believe, both terms, I believe, Speakes acted as press secretary, but he kept the title of assistant press secretary. They wanted to let Brady maintain that title out of respect for him. Benjamin J. Stein, White House speechwriter. Yes, the same Ben Stein that later had Ben Stein's Money on TV and so forth. John C. Stennis, Senator, Democrat of Mississippi. William E. Timmons, Chief of White House Liaison to the Congress. Major General Walter Takash, Physician to the President. Lieutenant General Vernon Walters, Deputy Director, Central Intelligence Agency. Gerald Warren, Deputy Press Secretary to the President. Clay T. Whitehead, Director, White House Office of Telecommunications Policy, Coordinator, Transition Team. Charles Wiggins, Congressman, Republican of California, Member, House Judiciary Committee. Rosemary Woods, Personal Secretary to the President. Charles Allen Wright, Special Counsel to the President for Watergate. Ronald L. Ziegler, Press Secretary to the President. And so we're going to wrap this session up, and the next session will begin with the main text of the book, beginning with Part 1, Chapter 1. Thank you for watching.